Death Valley, hottest place on earth. More than just a name, Death Valley is the bad boy of all deserts. Staggering extremes of the norm, rising mountains and falling valley floors create the defining drama. The knife-blade peaks of the Panamint Mountains loom above Badwater Basin, 2 miles of whiplash-inducing elevation change. That's twice what occurs at the Grand Canyon. Amid the expanse of Death Valley is an endless assortment of dramatic scenery. You'll find deep, rugged canyons, haunting badlands, sand dunes, lake beds, craters, and even flowing streams and fragile wetlands. Nearly 1,000 native plant species dot the landscape, and dozens of animal species prowl the hills. Located near the border of California and Nevada in the Great Basin, east of the Sierra Nevada mountains, Death Valley constitutes much of Death Valley National Park and is the principal feature of the Mojave and Colorado Deserts Biosphere Reserve. It is located mostly in Inyo County, California. It runs from north to south between the Amargosa Range on the east and the Panamint Range on the west. The Sylvania Mountains and the Owlshed Mountains form its northern and southern borders, respectively. It has an area of about 3,000 square miles. The highest point in Death Valley itself is Telescope Peak in the Panamint Range, which has an elevation of 11,043 feet. The lowest point is Badwater Basin and has an elevation of 282 feet below sea level. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 triggered a migration that put Death Valley decisively on the map. A group of pioneers bound for the gold fields arrived in Salt Lake City too late in the year of 1849 to attempt crossing the treacherous snow-choked passes of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It had only been a couple of years since the ill-fated Donner Party was trapped among those ragged peaks. To survive, those unfortunates resorted to cannibalism. Rather than wait until spring, the 49ers swung southwest on the old Spanish Trail led by Captain Jefferson Hunt. But progress was slow. Many in the party broke off from the main wagon train to follow a rumored shortcut to the west. Almost immediately, they found the way blocked by a steep-sided canyon. Most returned to follow the old Spanish Trail, but more than 20 wagons forged ahead. It proved to be a grueling ordeal, requiring several weeks to cross the deserts of central Nevada. The emigrants reached Death Valley in December, breaking into small groups as they traveled. It had been 2 months since they struck out on their own. Their oxen were nearly starved, and the pioneers weren't much better off. From Furnace Creek, one faction, the Jayhawkers, turned north. Upon reaching the edge of the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, they decided they would have to walk out. They slaughtered their oxen and used the wood of their wagons to cook and jerk the meat. The Bennett Arkin families attempted to cross the salt flats, but were too weak to continue. They dispatched 2 of their young men, William Lewis Manley and John Rogers, to find a route over the mountains and return with supplies. The pair walked nearly 270 miles to Mission San Fernando, where they bought supplies and retraced their steps to the waiting families. The journey took 26 days. As the last of the pioneers climbed across the Panamint Mountains, legend says they looked back and exclaimed, "Goodbye, Death Valley." This year, my family was lucky enough to visit various national parks in California, and Death Valley was one of them. So let's take a look at some of the photos that we were able to take of the sites that we saw. Most of our tour through Death Valley involved being in a car, for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. This is called the Artist Drive. It's a twisting loop that moseys through colorful foothills of the Black Mountains. The road clambers up an alluvial fan. Rain may be scarce here, but it creates a sensation when it does arrive. Precipitation hits the higher elevations and gets funneled into canyons that drain the mountains. The surging water gains speed, roaring through narrow channels and gathering loose material along the way. As it rushes out of the canyon mouth and into the open valley, the water loses energy. It begins to drop its sediment load and spread into multiple streams. The apron of rocky debris at the base of the mountain is an alluvial fan. As Artist Drive dips in and out of rain-scoured gorges, it provides an interesting look at the inner layers of this particular fan. The one-way loop is paved for its entire 9 miles. Make the quick turn off to Artist's Palette, a beautiful overlook of intense spectrum of colors splashed across the furrowed hills, seen here in this picture. The reds, pinks, oranges, yellows, and browns are due to the presence of hematite, a red iron oxide, and limonite, a yellow iron oxide. The green is from chlorite and the blue is from manganese. This is a great drive to make in the late afternoon as the colors intensify. This picture shows my son Benny in one of these gorges. If it had been raining, you wouldn't be able to stand here because there would be water rushing through this area. But as you can see in the picture, there's not a cloud in the sky. Again, it's the desert. It doesn't rain that much. This is a picture of my daughter Lizzie standing in what's called the Devil's Golf Course. This area was once covered by an ancient saline lake, or saltwater lake. The water dried up, leaving behind layers of salt that have been twisted and gnarled by the forces of erosion. Serrated spires rise into a chaotic jumble, and the valley floor is a ragged, scabby terrain that seems to stretch for miles. There are no hiking trails across this playa, but you can proceed with caution. Don't damage the crystals and don't injure yourself on the sharp edges. This is not a place for flip-flops, as you can see by this close-up of the salt crystals. Death Valley swallows noise, and this is one of those places where it becomes distinctly noticeable. You can see the road and its flow of traffic, but the sound of cars dies on the creosote flats. Despite the playful name, the Devil's Golf Course is a haunting spot. A Park Service sign gives a bit of an explanation for the eerie terrain and then states this disturbing fact. Listen carefully. On a warm day, you may hear a metallic cracking sound as the salt pinnacles expand and contract. Great. Imagine you're all by yourself in this foreboding place. You wander a few tentative steps out into the jagged maze. The stillness threatens to overwhelm you, and all of a sudden, you hear, right behind you, crack, the sound of a gun being cocked. Yikes, that would be scary. We actually did hear that sound several times while we were out walking around. However, it wasn't quite as foreboding since we were all together. As we traveled through the park, I kept making my husband stop to take pictures of the marker signs. Every time we were at sea level, 100 feet below sea level, 200 feet below sea level, and then of course we had to stop at Badwater Basin, which is the lowest point in the United States. Badwater Basin is 282 feet below sea level, so that's negative 280 feet. It's pretty awesome because here in the background the mountains go up to over 11,000 feet, which means that you've got over 2 miles of an elevation change from this point up to the top of the mountain. Badwater Basin is named for a shallow, briny pool that is located at the base of the Black Mountains, seen here in the background of the picture. It's not actually poisonous, just salty as seawater. At 282 feet below sea level, you're standing in the lowest spot in North America. To snap things into perspective, glance up at rocky cliffs high above and you'll spot a barely legible sign that reads sea level, although you can't see it in the photograph. There's a boardwalk around the pool to avoid crushing the tiny snails that call this beachfront property home. Then continue on to the blinding whiteness of the flats. The salt pan, it's about 95% pure table salt, covers 200 square miles, a scorched crust cape of shimmering sun haze. Walk beyond crowds to gain a sense of the sprawling dimensions and utter desolation. Don't go far if it's summer, lest the heat overpower you. They're not kidding around when they say don't go too far. This was 10 a.m. on this morning, and you can see by the car thermometer, it was already 116 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're not kidding when we say that Death Valley can be one of the hottest places on Earth. I have to also say, I saw one of the funniest things I think I've ever seen. Apparently, somebody thought it would be funny to test out whether or not you could cook an egg in the heat. You can see, it worked. And then they just left the pan and the extra egg there for anybody to, I guess if they were hungry, they could take a bite of that. It doesn't look too appetizing, but again, in 116 degree heat, it did cook. For those like me, they have these signs across the park that remind you that there's an extreme heat danger and walking after 10 a.m. is not recommended. However, at the stops and bathrooms and things, they all have signs there telling you how many liters of water you're going to need if you're out walking around after 10 a.m. in the heat. So the park is going to make sure that hopefully you stay safe. Up until recently, one of the biggest mysteries in Death Valley was this area called the Playa Track. Now, a playa means a dry lake or riverbed, and of course, racetrack would indicate, place where things are racing across the lake bed. But here, what we see are rocks that have traveled across the lake bed, leaving tracks behind. And these do not move quickly, they move actually quite slowly. And up until recently, we had no idea how this was happening. It wasn't too long ago when we discovered that a thin layer of ice would form on top of the lake bed, allowing the rocks to sort of skid across and leave a track behind. And then the ice would melt and would dry back up, and what you would have would be the rock with the trail behind it and no reasonable way that it had moved. So nowadays we know what's going on a little better because we've caught it in action finally. Coming to the end of what I have to tell you about Death Valley, although there's way more things that we could see, we just didn't have the time there. But let's go over our fact sheet. Death Valley National Monument was established in 1933 by President Herbert Hoover. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed the California Desert Protection Act that promoted Death Valley to a national park and increased its acreage. It is a big old place, twice as large as Delaware. The park covers 3.4 million acres across California with a triangle-shaped thrust into Nevada. It is America's largest national park outside of Alaska. The lowest elevation here is Badwater Basin. Remember, it's 282 feet below sea level and is the lowest point in North America. The highest elevation in Death Valley is in the Panamint Mountains over the west side of the valley, most prominently called Telescope Peak, which rises to 11,049 feet. The highest ever recorded temperature was taken here, where you're looking in this picture, which is Furnace Creek, on July 10th, 1913. A reading of 134 degrees Fahrenheit was taken that day. Even higher, though, Death Valley's official temperature is recorded at a weather station which is 5 feet off the ground. But the ground gets hotter than the air, and the highest ground temperature recorded here was 201 degrees Fahrenheit on July 15th, 1972. The amount of rainfall that we get here? Barely. The average annual rainfall in Death Valley is about 1.94 inches. In 1929 and in 1953, no rain at all was recorded. Snowfall. While the valley floor is the driest place in North America, the highest reaches of the Panamint Mountains can receive 15 inches of precipitation. That translates into 20 feet of snow on Telescope Peak. But what is it about Death Valley that just makes it so unlucky, that it's so hot, that it's so dry? Well, it's geology. Blame the extreme dryness on simple geography. Storms form in the Pacific Ocean and they roll inland. Along the way, they cross a series of mountain ranges, forcing the clouds to rise. As clouds push upwards, they cool, and the moisture condenses to fall as rain or snow on the western slopes. By the time the clouds reach the east side of the mountains, they have spent their available moisture, creating what we call a rain shadow. 4 major north-south mountain ranges create an effective cloud-spearing blockade between the ocean and Death Valley, each one adding to an increasingly drier rain shadow effect. Death Valley receives less than 2 inches of rain annually. Even worse, Death Valley's rate of evaporation is 150 inches of water per year. A 12-foot deep lake with no other source of water would turn into a dust bowl in 1 year. It is a dry heat. I hope that you've enjoyed learning just a little bit about Death Valley. We're going to be doing an experiment in class where we look at how salt water will dry and leave behind the crystals, just like it has done in Badwater Basin and Devil's Golf Course, which were mentioned in this presentation.